Okay, so it was interesting for me, this process. I started, like a lot of people in the AFL industry, I was stood down from my job as a senior writer for the AFL Record in pretty much the day after the season shut down in sort of late March. And I used that time, the season was shut down for 81 days. For about 70 of those days, I wasn't working. So I used that time to almost take a bit of a mental break from football and delve into some other interests, exercise, Netflix, books, that sort of thing. And I would dial into the probably once a day, late afternoon, I'd sort of catch up with the news of the day, what was happening in the footy world. But it occurred to me pretty quickly there were fundamental decisions and really big picture decisions being made almost every day, and major significant announcements most days, either from the AFL or the clubs. And there's some juicy stories taking place as well in the game in that time. It occurred to me, well, someone's got to be writing the book about this because so much interesting stuff's happened, and didn't think too much more about it. Assumed that one of my colleagues or it was well on the path to writing the book about the season that never was. And then I returned to work when the season resumed June 11. So I returned to work about a week before that, but only working a couple of days a week. So I still had a bit of time to kill, but again, didn't pay too much attention. Then on July 25, I got an email from my former boss, Age Slattery, a well-known sort of book editor and publisher, sports journalist in Melbourne, who said to me, I know this is short notice and going to sound a bit odd, but if you've got any capacity to write the book about the year, no one's actually writing the book. So I barely finished reading his email when I decided this was the book I really wanted to write. I mean, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to chronicle the most unusual season ever played, and the sort of book that, if done properly, people are going to use it as a source of reference for in 10, 20, 50 years, 100 years time to ask the question, how did the AFL, how did the biggest sport in the country negotiate a pandemic? Not a lot is written about the Spanish flu in 1919 and how league football dealt with that. So here was a chance to sort of rectify that a century on. So I was very quick to say yes. The process was, we knew we didn't have a lot of time. The initial thought was it'd be a Christmas release for this book, so we've had really to thrash it out. But in the end, the wiser heads prevailed, and we decided to make it a book that would come out on the eve of the season, which was the middle of March. But I had a lot of people to speak to and not a lot of time, so it was a matter of going back. I was very fortunate. I'm obviously on the AFL's media list, so I kept one of the things I did do was keep all the emails, just in case I thought maybe one day I'll need all the big announcements they've made. So I managed to have all their media releases going back to when the season shut down as a point of reference, and then your club emails as well, the media releases. Then using Google to sort of work out what the big stories were and who the key players were, and a lot of the big decisions and big stories that happened over the shutdown and before and afterwards. And then it was 30 years of contacts. I've been a footy writer in Melbourne for 30 years, so I've got a fairly deep list of contacts. So given the brevity and we didn't have a lot of time, I decided it was best to speak to people I had a prior relationship with. So instead of trying to track down someone I didn't know at a club, it was, okay, who are the people I know that work at the AFL? Who are the people I know that work at the clubs and in the industry? A lot of them were in hubs, so I had to make arrangements. Zoom became my best friend. I very quickly signed up and grabbed a Zoom account because of my own, because I needed to do a lot of these sort of interviews. Ideally, as we are doing now, is speaking on Zoom. It was really important to have that face-to-face contact, because I was doing interviews of 1 to 2 hours at a time sometimes, and really getting people to walk me through their entire year. So it was better doing it over Zoom where possible than over the phone. Couldn't do anything face-to-face. I wasn't one of the 20 or so AFL journalists who were in the hub. The AFL sent about 12, 15 journalists to Queensland on their own dime initially to be there when the game resumed. So I didn't have that advantage. So it was really just ring people, can we catch up on Zoom? And in most cases, people were pretty good because they understood the importance of telling the story and the story being told right. And people gave me a lot of time. Some very high-powered people in the industry were very generous with their time. And once the AFL gave their sort of assent for the book, almost gave the book their blessing, they've got a good relationship with Age Slattery, that opened up a whole lot of doors as well. So I had access to pretty much every member of the AFL executive, the chairman, Richard Goyder. Suddenly my diary was full very quickly with these people who were keen to speak to me and wanted their story told and wanted to make sure the story was told properly and accurately. So that was great. For example, the day before the grand final, I had 1.5 hours on Zoom with Gil McLachlan, the chief executive of the AFL, and that's, you know, in a Melbourne grand final, he'd be the day before the grand final, he'd be going from event to event to event. You'd be lucky to get 5 minutes with him that week. But there he was in Brisbane in his hotel room with not much to do other than prepare his speech for the official function the next day. So he was very happy to jump on Zoom for an hour and a half and basically give me a brain dump on the entire season and walk me through these incredibly big decisions he had to make in his perspective. So in a lot of ways, it's actually been a privilege to write the book, because the chance to sort of tap into some really smart, impressive people and leaders in the AFL industry to walk me through the year has been, to me, was a great joy, and then to be able to then try and distill it all into words, that was the challenge as well. Well, the challenge was that people, it's recent memory for people, so you've got to make sure you've reported. It's very easy when people say, well, that actually didn't happen because I was there, or I remember it happening. So that was an immediate challenge. The other challenge I faced was time. I mean, you know, I had to do probably 30 interviews that had to be transcribed, or what was not in a position to get someone to, you know, to transcribe it for me. So I had to do the transcribe myself and then piece all together. And not having written a book from start, I've edited books and I've contributed to books. This is the first book I've written from start to finish myself. So I had to sort of work out what approach I wanted to take. And I started down one path, which was to write sort of a chapter per person almost, and then go back and forth in time. But then after about 4 chapters into it, I realized this is not going to work. I wasn't happy. So I dialed it back and said, no, I'm just going to go chronological. I'm going to pick up the story from the very first day, the very first person in the AFL heard about COVID, and then walk it through from there. And I was much more happy with that approach. But again, my background as a writer, as a sort of magazine writer, or as a newspaper, my training as a newspaper journalist. So I decided the way I'd be most comfortable writing it, given that how relatively little time I had, was to write almost 30 self-contained feature stories with some tying into the other, and some leading to the next chapter. But really, it's 30 feature stories that just run chronologically, and that was a method I was most comfortable in writing. If I had a year to do it, or 2 years to do it, or and I wasn't doing a couple of things on the side, I may have approached it a bit differently. But given what I had to work with, that was the approach I was most comfortable taking. I sort of knew from observation, but what I learned from speaking to people was the incredible collaboration that took place in that industry over all of 2020. Over 2020. So the thing about the AFL is, it's a collection. In some ways, it's a collection of sworn enemies, and there's a major competition between them, not just when the games are played, but in drafting and recruiting, and in practices, in hiring, and all sorts of things. They keep things to themselves, and they adopt best practices, and they don't like to share. But the entire industry was pretty much understood from the get-go last year that if we don't work together, we're not going to get through this. There'll be no game, and $750 million worth of revenue is going to be threatened if we don't work together and get through this together. So the only competition really that took place in the AFL last year was a 2 and a bit hours. And it was only 2 and a bit hours because they were shortened quarters. It was a 2 and a bit hours of every game. Otherwise, it was an incredibly collaborative approach, people working together and people just sharing ideas, sharing IP. How can I help you? I mean, we had club doctors in the hub working for 2 or 3 different teams at a time, which is quite remarkable. The Gold Coast and Brisbane teams basically threw open their facilities and resources to the rest of the competition, saying, you're coming to us now instead of us coming to you. We'll give you whatever you need. Teams were negotiating and sharing over. There were 3 or 4 training venues in the Gold Coast, and teams would work together to, so they were all trained at different times that suited. And teams would say, okay, we'll take the lesser venue so we can train at the time we want. And other teams would say, that's fine, we'll train a different day so that you can have access to the facilities that you need. So that was remarkable. And that's, you talk to the AFL people, and that keeps coming back to this spirit of collaboration and cooperation that without it, they wouldn't have got a season away. Well, I think there's people have seen the existential threat now. So I think there'll be more. So more collaboration. I mean, they've gone back to a lot of their old ways in a way, and back to being far more competitive off the field as well. But I think they've all been a bit scared about how fragile things could be. So there's that element. The AFL mantra last year was very much around flexible and agile. They've been, in some respects, haven't been as flexible and agile this year with a couple of decisions that they could have been. I mean, people are saying this, last year we had games for 30, we had 20 straight days of games in the middle of the season, what they called the footy frenzy. So people are saying, well, we can have games across multiple days of the week now because we've shown that we can do it. And they've gone back to the very traditional fixturing this year, which has surprised a few people. People thought that the grand finals played at night at the Gabba, and people thought, well, great, we can have a night grand final, or certainly a later start to the grand final now, but they surprised a lot of people by saying, no, we're going back to 2:30 Saturday afternoon for the grand final start time. I actually understand why they did that. I think they wanted to return as much normality to the season as they can. I think also a lot of the decision making for this year has been based around the fact that Victoria really was hurt last year. Victoria, which is the cradle of the game, so the game was born. There was no AFL football played in Melbourne after round 5. Fans couldn't go to one game in Victoria all year, and there was no grassroots football. None of the suburban country junior semi-professional leagues played any footy in Victoria last year. So I think there was a real feeling the game in Victoria was very fragile. So we're going to do everything we can to bring that back to good health in 2021, and we're going to go back to doing things the tried and true way that people are comfortable with. So that's been so there haven't been all the legacies of last year, but they know what they can do if they need to. And even as we record this, I mean, they're moving. Fremantle's moving back to a mini hub in Queensland for a couple of weeks because the situation in Perth is so unstable with the COVID outbreak that they've said to Freo, no, you're going back to Queensland now, and you're going to play a couple of games and be based up there for a while. So that's a legacy of last year. That and Freo can say, yep, we did it last year, no problem. We know what to do. We know what the facilities are. We know we'll be able to handle it, and they get in a plane in a couple of days to do it. That's both interesting questions. The first part, in some ways, the most successful season ever played because the existential threats were enormous. And you look at the AFL season went ahead compared to so many of the major sports around the world. We had one player test positive over the course of the entire season, where the major European and American sporting leagues were decimated by COVID. The AFL ended up having a degree of normality about its season. So the fact they got a season away, I think, can be viewed as an enormously successful season. So there's that. I mean, there's other seasons we've had record crowds and better games and what have you. And the quality of football last year varied. There was some ordinary football played in the middle of the year when teams are playing off 3 and 4 day breaks and the players were tired. They're playing in wet grounds on wet nights in Queensland. The footy wasn't particularly great. So aesthetically, it wasn't the best season ever played, but from the fact that they completed the season was quite remarkable. I never subscribed to the theory that it was an asterisk season. I was of the view that whichever team won the premiership, and as we know, it turned out to be Richmond, was the most hard-fought and deserved premiership ever won by a team. I mean, the amount of hurdles, they in particular, Richmond, they had so many hurdles to overcome. They were led by their coach, were very sceptical. They were COVID skeptics early. It took a long time to adjust, and it wasn't really till they moved to Queensland and got away from all the distractions and all the noise in Melbourne that they started to turn their season around. They had some distractors up there. There was allegations of players sticking their fingers in the bum of another teammate during a victory circle, and they had what's called Kebab Gate, where a couple of players disappeared from their hub and went into Surfers Paradise and got to fight in Cavill Avenue at 3:30 in the morning, which is a lot of people watching this will have been to surface at 3:30 in the morning will know that nothing good can happen in Cavill Avenue at 3:30 in the morning. So they overcame that and ended up winning a premiership. So I would say that was a remarkable achievement. So I think it was as I said, it wasn't the best season of football ever played, but the worth of the premiership was enormous. And there certainly should be, if there's an asterisk on the season, it should be that this is a gold standard premiership and better and more hard won than any other premiership that's been played for before.